The scaffolding had gone up on a Tuesday. 4 sections of aluminum and planking erected along the approach plaza's east and north edges, their legs anchored in the flagstone that the work crew would spend the next 6 weeks resurfacing. The tomb itself stood untouched. The marble was the same pale gray it had always been, the inscription facing outward across the cemetery, the way it had faced through 2 world wars and a dozen conflicts nobody had gotten around to naming properly. The mat in front of it, that long dark rectangle of rubber and compressed memory, was where it had always been. On the morning in question, a cold Thursday in October, a crowd had gathered at the plaza's viewing rail. Not a large crowd, perhaps 30 people. A retired couple with a cemetery map folded into a precise square, their shoulders touching in the way of people who have stood side by side at difficult places before. A man in a veteran's cap whose insignia read Vietnam, 1968, his hands loose on the top rail, his weight settled into the stance of someone who intended to stay a while. A school group, maybe a dozen middle schoolers with a harried teacher moving quietly behind them, adjusting their spacing with small gestures. And scattered among these a few visitors who had arrived without any ceremony in mind, simply because Arlington in October is a place that asks something of you even when you come unprepared. What no one in that crowd anticipated, at least not the ones who hadn't read a single word about the old guard, was the figure who appeared at the far edge of the plaza at 8:43 in the morning and took his first measured stride onto the mat. Specialist Jack Martinez was 26 years old and walked as though the earth owed him nothing. His dress blues were pressed to a sharpness that seemed implausible in October air, the crease in each trouser leg a single straight line from hip to boot. The boots themselves were black and deep, polished to a surface that caught the pale morning light and held it the way still water holds a reflection, giving it back without alteration. His white gloves covered hands that hung still at his sides, and the M14 rifle at his right shoulder was chrome-finished and absolutely level, its barrel a fixed meridian above the plaza's pale stone. He walked 21 steps. He stopped. He turned, facing out over the cemetery, and he counted. 21 seconds, his eyes level and unmoving, pointed somewhere past the tree line and through it, into a distance that had nothing to do with the geography of the cemetery. He turned again and walked 21 steps back. The cadence was not mechanical. It was slower than mechanical. It was the kind of deliberateness that happens when a person has made a genuine decision about each stride, has decided that each stride will be given its full weight, and intends to honor that decision for the full duration of the watch. Each step planted cleanly, each heel down and then the ball, the trouser crease holding its line through the turn, the rifle unwavering at the shoulder. The crowd at the rail felt it within the first 2 passes. The school group went quiet without being told. The retired couple lowered their map and did not raise it again. The veteran's cap tilted slightly forward as the man beneath it leaned into the rail. Jack did not look at any of them. He had been assigned to this post for 14 months. The old guard works its sentinels in 2-hour rotations, on and off through every hour of the day and every hour of the night, in every season the Potomac Valley can produce. 14 months on this rotation meant that Jack Martinez had walked this specific mat through sleet, through July heat that came up off the stone in visible waves, through the particular gray cold of an October morning that sits on the back of the neck and reminds you that winter is not a rumor. He had walked it through Memorial Day ceremonies attended by hundreds, and through 4 in the morning when the only witnesses were the security lights along the path and whatever birds were awake in the cemetery's oaks. Before that, he had come back from 18 months in Kandahar province, where he had served as a dismounted infantryman with the 82nd Airborne Division, and where he had learned in the most permanent way available to a person that some debts cannot be paid, only carried. What he carried now was ceremonial and visible. The rest he carried in his breast pocket, in a place nobody would find it unless they asked directly, and nobody asked directly. The construction crew arrived at 9:15. They came in a white pickup truck and a contractor's van, 4 workers in hard hats and 2 supervisors, one of whom was a man named Raymond Colt. Raymond was 53 years old and had been overseeing masonry and hardscape renovation across the greater D.C. area for 22 years. He held contracts with the National Park Service, with the Smithsonian, and, as of 6 weeks ago, with Arlington National Cemetery for the resurfacing of the approach plaza's flagstone aprons on the east and north sides. Raymond was a man who knew how to read a job site. He had read thousands of them. He knew where the load-bearing columns were and where the cosmetic ones were. He knew how to move a crew through a complicated space without losing time to indecision. He also knew how to talk to the people he encountered on job sites, whether they were museum staff or park rangers or, as on this particular morning, a soldier in dress blues walking a measured line in front of a marble sarcophagus. He had developed, over 22 years, a confidence so thorough that it had long since ceased to feel like confidence and had come to feel simply like accuracy. He looked at the scaffold sections, looked at the mat, looked at the figure walking its measured line, and he looked at the construction access permit clipped to his clipboard. He said something to the worker nearest him, a young man named Torres, and Torres nodded and began unloading equipment from the van. Raymond crossed the plaza toward the south end of the work zone and noticed for the first time that the mat area where the sentinel walked was ringed by a chain cordon set on low brass stanchions. He noticed it the way a person notices a familiar street sign while driving. Present, registered, not a source of concern. A crowd management measure, he assumed. Standard procedure for a tourist site during construction. Something that would, when the time came, be moved to wherever it needed to be moved. He posted himself near the north scaffold section and began directing his crew in the matter-of-fact way of someone who had been doing this before most of the school group's parents were born. His voice carried a natural authority, the unhurried authority of a man who expects to be listened to and generally is. Jack completed his pass. He turned. He began walking back. Raymond watched him for perhaps 30 seconds. There was no hostility in the watching. There was no particular curiosity either. It was the assessment of a job site supervisor cataloging the variables in his workspace, and the sentinel was a variable. Present, noted, probably relevant to material routing. Raymond turned to Torres and said, in a voice loud enough for the nearest section of the crowd to hear clearly, "Tell the young soldier we're going to need him to stand down for a couple hours while we move materials through. This is a work zone." Torres looked uncertain. He was 20 years old and had been on Raymond's crew for 7 months. He had been to Arlington twice in his life, both times as a child. He understood the basic instruction his supervisor had given him, and also understood, in a way that he could not yet articulate, that there was something wrong with it. Torres did not relay the message. Raymond looked back at Jack. Jack had reached the far end of the mat, turned and was walking back toward them at the same unhurried, irresistible cadence. Raymond waited until Jack had passed his position, then said, at a volume clearly meant to carry, "Son, work zone. You don't need to keep this up while we're moving materials." Jack did not turn his head. He walked 21 steps. He stopped. He counted. He turned. The crowd at the rail had gone very still. The Vietnam veteran in the cap, whose name was Walt Pridmore, had been leaning against the rail with his hands loose at the top. Now he straightened slowly and put both hands flat on the railing. He was watching Raymond the way a man watches weather coming in from the west, with the patience of someone who has stood in weather before and knows it does not negotiate. Raymond said, to nobody in particular, but at a volume the nearest dozen visitors could hear without difficulty, "I've seen these guys. They're not going to break protocol no matter what. Just give him a wide berth when we move the flagstones through." He said it as though this were useful information, as though he were explaining the Sentinel's immovability as a feature of the attraction, the way a docent at a wax museum explains that the figures behind the rope cannot be touched, something to be worked around, accommodated, routed past. "Works for us," he added, turning back to his clipboard. A woman standing 2 positions down the rail said nothing. She had a gold star pin on her coat lapel, small and plain, and she was looking at the inscription on the marble with the concentrated attention of someone who has been doing that for a long time and has not finished yet. She heard Raymond's words. She did not acknowledge them. The school group's teacher moved the children 6 inches closer together without announcing she was doing it. Jack walked his line. The crowd watched. Raymond directed the movement of equipment to the north scaffold section, and for the next 40 minutes the job site and the post existed in a kind of parallel, each performing its own rhythms without acknowledgement of the other. The scrape of a pallet dolly on flagstone, the 21 steps, the hiss of a cordless drill biting stone, the 21-second pause, the turn, a worker calling a measurement across the scaffold, the turn again. 2 sets of rhythms, one of them provisional and practical, built to end in 6 weeks, one of them not provisional at all. If you've never stood at the viewing rail at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier during a sentinel's watch, you might wonder what keeps the crowd there. It is not spectacle. The sentinel does not perform. There is no music, no narration, no moment of crescendo. What holds the crowd at the rail is something simpler and harder to name: the recognition that they are watching a person who is fully present, completely accounted for, entirely committed to a single act, and has been so for longer than the visit began and will be so long after the visit ends. It is the rarest thing most visitors will ever see. It is the reason the school group's teacher stopped trying to manage her students, because they were already managing themselves. Jack walked his line. He had been walking it for 11 years in one form or another. Not literally this mat, not literally these 21 steps, not always in dress blues. He had walked a different kind of line in Kandahar, one that was not ceremonial and not measured in steps, but in the distance between your own body and the nearest available cover. He had walked it beside people who carried that distance differently from one another, some with jokes and some with silence, some by running through the calculations out loud, and some by keeping the calculations entirely inside, where they couldn't contaminate anyone else. One of them had done it with a forward observer's cool and exact attention to every variable in the field: wind speed, range, elevation, the patience to wait until the calculation was complete before she acted on it. She had been the kind of person who made everyone around her better at their own job, not by explaining anything, but simply by being visibly more thorough than the situation seemed to require. That thoroughness had a name. At 20 minutes past 10, Jack's hand moved to his breast pocket. Not dramatically. The rifle was at his right shoulder, the right hand fixed on the stock. The left hand was at his side. The gesture was so small that only the people watching his left side from close range would have seen it. A brief press of the gloved palm against the fabric, the way a person checks a pocket to confirm something is still there. Then the hand returned to its position. In that pocket was a photograph. He had put it there himself that morning during uniform preparation, moved it carefully from one breast pocket to the other, smoothing the fabric flat after. The photograph was not large. It was 3 inches by 4, a standard service portrait, the kind taken at a formal occasion. The woman in it was 23 years old in the photograph and would remain 23 years old in perpetuity. Staff Sergeant Clara Ruiz, Forward Observer. Kandahar Province. She had died 11 years ago in the kind of engagement that takes a long time to describe accurately on paper and almost no time at all to happen. Jack had been 40 meters away when it happened. He had not been able to close that distance in time. That was the fact. He had been carrying the fact for 11 years, and he had been carrying her photograph for 11 years, and the weight of each was different, but they were not separate weights. What no one in that crowd yet knew, including Raymond, was that the person walking that line was not performing discipline. He was discharging a debt. The distinction does not look different from 30 feet. It feels completely different from the inside. The construction work continued. Torres moved a section of scaffold planking to the east side of the staging area. Another worker ran a measuring tape along the north apron. Raymond stood at his clipboard, cross-referencing the materials log with the morning's delivery. He was a thorough man. His thoroughness did not extend to the particular history of the institution he was currently standing inside, but his thoroughness in matters of logistics and material flow was genuine. At 10:22, Raymond received a radio call from his site coordinator about a revised delivery window for the ceiling compound scheduled for the following week. He listened, noted the adjustment, and then walked the perimeter of the work zone with his clipboard, reassessing the traffic flow his crew would need to move the next flagstone sections from the van to the north scaffold staging area. The most direct path, he determined, ran through the south side of the cordon. He looked at the chain. He looked at the stanchions, which were brass-finished and set at regular intervals, each one connected by a length of braided chain that caught the gray light with a dull gleam. He looked at his access permit, which authorized his crew's presence on the east and north apron sections of the approach plaza. He did the calculation the way he had done thousands of job site calculations. Identify the obstacle, identify the authority, determine whether the authority extends to the obstacle. He concluded, incorrectly, that a crowd management cordon and a federal work order occupied different categories of authority. It was not an unreasonable conclusion for a man who had never needed to think carefully about which category the tomb of the unknown soldier's security perimeter belonged to. He had simply never encountered a situation where the question had mattered before. He called Torres over. "Those chains," he said at a volume that carried easily across the quiet plaza, "that's just a crowd management cordon. Nothing on the work order exempts it from the access corridor. Move them back to the far side of the mat so we can route the flagstone through." Torres looked at the chain. Torres looked at the sentinel, who was currently at the far end of the mat, completing his count. Torres looked back at his supervisor. "Those chains," Raymond said again, in the patient voice of a man who does not expect to repeat himself more than twice, "are not part of the guard post. That guard is going to keep walking regardless. That's what they do. Move the chains." Walt Pridmore's hands came off the rail. He pushed himself upright and took one step back from the viewing area. He was not a large man, and the step back was not a retreat. It was the step a person takes when they are making room to respond. The unconscious repositioning of someone who has spent time in places where positioning matters. The woman with the gold star pin turned her head from the inscription for the first time since she had arrived. The teacher pulled the children closer again without being entirely aware she was doing it, the instinctive gathering of a person who senses that the space around her is about to change. Torres reached for the nearest stanchion. His hand extended. His fingers were perhaps 6 inches from the brass fitting at the chain's attachment point. He did not touch it. Because Jack had already turned from the far end of the mat, and he was walking back and his eyes had moved. Not far. Not in any way a casual observer might have described as dramatic. 2 degrees of arc, perhaps 3. The small, precise adjustment of a gun barrel being brought to alignment. His gaze was now precisely on Torres and on Torres's hand, hovering above the stanchion, 6 inches from the brass fitting. Torres's hand came down to his side. Raymond looked at the sentinel. The sentinel was still walking. The cadence had not changed by a single count. The rifle had not shifted from the shoulder by a degree. The crease in the trouser leg held its line through each step as though it had been pressed there by something other than an iron, by something closer to intention. 21 steps, as written and as practiced, and at the end of them Jack stopped, and he turned, and he faced Raymond Colt directly across a distance of perhaps 12 feet. The plaza held its breath. Jack said, "This area is under the jurisdiction of the United States Army. The cordon does not move." 8 words, if you counted the contraction as 1, delivered at the volume of a person giving a weather report. No particular emphasis placed on any single syllable, no rise in the voice at the end, no edge carried from anywhere personal. The authority in the sentence was procedural. It was the kind of statement that does not require volume, because it is not making an argument. It is citing a fact that was in place before either party arrived at this location and will be in a place after both of them leave. The sentence simply named the fact and stopped. The plaza stayed quiet. A bird somewhere in the cemetery oaks called twice and did not call again. Torres was very still. The 3 other workers had stopped moving without being instructed to. Raymond Colt opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his clipboard, at the work order that had authorized his presence here, at the line items and the access notations and the permit number in the upper right corner. He looked at the chain cordon, which was in exactly the same position it had been when he arrived, and which had been in that position for longer than his contract existed, and which had been in that position for longer than his career had existed. "I've got a work order," he said. His voice had changed register, not loud now. The confidence that had been its operating frequency for the morning had vacated it, not all at once, but enough that the difference was audible to anyone listening. The sentence trailed slightly at its end, the way sentences do when the speaker can already hear how it will land. Jack did not respond. He had delivered his one authorized line. The line was delivered. The situation would resolve itself, or it would require the next procedural step, and either way, his role had been fulfilled. He turned and walked 21 steps back to the far end of the mat. Torres took 2 quiet steps away from the stanchion. Raymond stood where he was. His clipboard was against his chest now, held in both hands, not consulting it, simply holding it. He looked at the chain cordon. He looked at the sentinel walking away from him at the same unhurried pace that the sentinel had been walking for the entire morning. He looked at the 30 people standing at the viewing rail, who were looking back at him with the patient, collective attention of a jury that has already reached its verdict and is simply waiting for the proceeding to complete itself. The crowd at the rail released a breath it had been holding for perhaps 2 full minutes, and in the space of that release, Walt Pridmore spoke. He had his cap in both hands, held against his chest. Not the way you hold a hat when you're done wearing it, but the way you hold something you are deliberately presenting to the occasion, the way the woman next to him held her hand against the marble railing. He spoke at a volume the whole rail could hear, the volume of a man in a church who wants the words to reach the back row without raising his voice to make them. "He's still here," Walt Pridmore said. "Place is half torn up and the kid is still here." Nobody added to it. Nobody needed to. The sentence stood in the October air with the weight that true sentences sometimes carry. When the right person says the right thing at the right moment, and everyone in earshot knows it without needing to analyze it. The woman with the gold star pin turned back to the inscription. She put one hand flat against the rail and kept it there. Her fingers spread against the cold, painted iron. The teacher had stopped trying to manage the school group entirely. All 12 of the students were at the rail now, quiet and self-organized, watching Jack walk his 21 steps back to the far end, watching him stop, watching him count. A girl near the front of the group kept her eyes on the mat through the whole turn, and when Jack began walking back, she turned her head to follow him. And her expression had the specific quality of someone who has seen something they will carry for a while without fully understanding why. Raymond Colt stood where he was for perhaps 20 seconds. He was a man who had spent 22 years being right about job sites, reading them accurately, calling the material and the timeline and the access correctly, often enough that the skill had become indistinguishable from identity. He now had the specific stillness of a person in the process of absorbing information that does not fit the established model, not information about the Sentinel, particularly. Information about the category of place he was standing in, which was not the category he had assigned to it when he arrived. He said something to Torres in a voice too low to carry across the plaza. Torres nodded. He said something to the other 2 workers, who nodded and began repositioning the flagstone delivery route along the south scaffold section, a route that added perhaps 20 minutes to the morning's work, but did not require touching the chain cordon or its stanchions. Raymond noted the rerouting in his clipboard. He clipped the pen back in its holder and moved to the north scaffold section. He did not look back at the mat. He was not cruel. He was not punished. He was a man who had misread the situation, and who, having been corrected by a person who could not be moved, was now in the business of adjusting his morning without making a production of it. He had spent 22 years being a professional. He intended to continue being one. The work continued. The 21 steps continued, each in its own rhythm, indifferent to the other. At 11:10, a second vehicle arrived at the plaza's service edge. It was not a contractor's van. It was a dark green sedan with government plates, and the man who stepped out of it was wearing dress greens with the rank insignia of a staff sergeant of the United States Army. This was Sergeant Dennis Okafor, Jack's post-relief for the next rotation, arriving slightly ahead of schedule. Okafor had a habit of arriving early when the weather was coming in cold or when the post had seen unusual activity. He had been advised on his way in that there had been some friction between the contractor and the duty sentinel. He had pulled his gloves on in the car and was fully composed before he reached the plaza's edge. Dennis Okafor had been with the old guard for 3 years. He was compact and deliberate the way a reliable piece of machinery is compact and deliberate, and he wore his dress greens with the same attention to the trouser crease that Jack wore his blues. He walked to the edge of the approach plaza, read the scene in perhaps 5 seconds, the way a person reads a scene when they have been trained to read scenes, and crossed to Raymond Colt's position at the north scaffold. "Are you the contractor of record for this job site?" Raymond confirmed that he was. "Your work order covers the east and north apron sections of the approach plaza," Okafor said. "The mat and the cordon are under Army jurisdiction and are not included in the access corridor. The work order language does not override the guard post's authority. If you need clarification in writing, I can get you the cemetery administration's contact information." He said it with the same procedural flatness that Jack had used. No edge to it. No attempt to make Raymond feel worse than he already felt. A citation of fact, offered as a courtesy so that everyone involved could make accurate decisions going forward. Raymond said, "I understand." He said it without embellishment, without explanation, without the habitual additions that people in his position often append to admissions of error, the excuses and the context and the good intentions. He said it the way a man says something when there is nothing more useful to add. Okafor nodded once, turned, and took his position at the edge of the approach plaza to wait out the remainder of Jack's rotation. He did not look at Raymond again. Raymond did not require being looked at. The situation was resolved. What Raymond would remember about that morning, in the way that certain mornings stay slightly different in memory from the generalized record of other mornings, was not the sentinel's words. He would remember the crowd at the rail, the way they had stood, the whole rail of them, with the quiet, collective authority of people who have been somewhere and seen something and have a specific opinion about what they saw. The man with both hands pressed against his cap. The woman with the gold star who had kept her hand flat on the railing even after the incident was over. The children who had gone entirely still without being told. He would remember that nobody in that crowd had said a single word directly to him, neither during the exchange nor after it, and that their silence had been its own kind of verdict, delivered without appeal and without cruelty, and that it had landed all the same. But that was later. At 11:27, Jack's rotation ended. Okafor took his place at the edge of the mat. The transfer was conducted with the precision that the old guard conducts these things, the incoming sentinel acknowledged by procedure rather than by ceremony, the outgoing sentinel formally released. It takes perhaps 45 seconds. To the school group, it looked like something between a greeting and a sacrament. To Jack, it was the end of a watch. He walked off the mat. He stopped once, at the edge of the approach plaza, before the path bent away toward the relief quarters. His gloved right hand moved to his breast pocket. Not dramatically, not in a way that most of the crowd would have registered as significant. A brief touch, deliberate and private, the press of a palm against fabric, there and then gone, the way you touch something to confirm it is still where it should be. Walt Pridmore noticed. He was standing back from the rail now, cap back on his head, watching the sentinel depart with the full attention of a man who has been watching ceremonies for a very long time and has learned that the true weight of them is often in the smallest gestures and not in the large ones. He saw the hand move. He saw it come away. He didn't say anything. He had already said what needed to be said, and the gesture on the mat's edge had completed something he could not have named precisely, but did not need to name precisely. Jack walked back toward the relief post at the plaza's south end. Behind him, Okafor stepped onto the mat. 21 steps, a pause, 21 seconds, a turn. The scaffolding stood where it had been erected on a Tuesday, 4 sections of aluminum, and planking along the east and north aprons. The work crew moved flagstone sections on their rerouted path, the pallet dollies scraping across the stone, the sound cutting away every 21 steps, absorbed by the weight of what was continuing on the mat regardless of the sound, regardless of the scaffolding, regardless of the October sky, and the renovation schedule, and the work order clipped to its clipboard. The school group's teacher gathered her students with a gesture that was softer than the ones she had been using all morning, one hand on the nearest child's shoulder, a quiet word that organized them without urgency. They moved off together, the children looking back over their shoulders at the mat as they went, the girl near the front turning twice before the path bent around the oak trees and the tomb passed out of their sight line. The retired couple folded their map away and did not leave for another 10 minutes, standing quietly at the rail while Okafor completed his first pass, watching the turn, watching the 21 steps back, watching the count. The woman spoke something quietly to the man beside her. He nodded and put his arm around her shoulder. They stood that way for a while, not watching with the attention of tourists, but with the attention of people who have earned the right to stand in a place like this and know it. Walt Pridmore was the last of the original crowd to leave the rail. He was a Gold Star father. His son's name was on a wall not far from here, and also in his memory in a way that walls cannot hold, in the way that the names of lost people exist in those who carry them, present at odd hours, present at ceremonies, present on a cold October Thursday at a marble sarcophagus in a cemetery outside Arlington, while a young soldier walked his line through construction equipment and a contractor's clipboard and the full weight of an ordinary working morning. Walt had been coming to Arlington for 31 years. He had seen ceremonies conducted in rain and in snow and in heat that made the marble look like it was breathing. He had never seen the old guard stop, not once in 31 years. He had not expected to be moved specifically by this particular October morning, which had started as a routine visit and had turned into something he would describe to people for some time after, inadequately. Because the things that move you are usually the ones that resist description, he said, to no one in particular and to everyone still standing at the rail. Every time. These kids are here every time. One of the middle schoolers, the girl near the front of the group, looked up at him briefly from several steps away on the path. She said nothing. She turned back toward the mat and watched Okafor walk until her class moved around the bend in the path, and she had to follow. The morning wore on. Okafor completed his rotation. Another sentinel came on post, and that sentinel walked the same 21 steps, stopped at the same 2 ends of the mat, counted the same interval, and turned and turned and turned. The scaffolding did not come down that morning. It would not come down for 6 weeks. The flagstone aprons would be resurfaced and sealed and would look better than they had looked in 20 years. The approach plaza would be, when the work was finished, restored. The tomb had not required restoration. Jack Martinez returned to the barracks at the old guard's quarters before noon. He ate lunch in the dining facility without ceremony and spent the early afternoon on uniform maintenance, which in the old guard is not a chore but a practice, the same category of activity as what happens on the mat. He worked the polish cloth across the boot in the same measured circles, the same attention given to each quarter-inch of leather that the cadence gives to each step. He worked methodically from the toe back, building the surface up in thin, even coats, checking his progress in the boot's reflection, which, by the 4th coat, was showing him the corner of the room behind him with enough clarity to be useful. He did not think about Raymond Colt. He did not think about the crowd's silence, or about Walt Pridmore's words at the rail, or about how the morning had looked from the outside. He did not inventory the events for evidence of his own correctness, because he had not acted for any of those reasons. He had acted because the cordon had jurisdiction, and the cordon had been threatened, and the authorized response was a single verbal warning, which he had given, and the matter had resolved, and now the boots needed polish, and the boots were getting it. He took the photograph out of his breast pocket, not to look at it in any ceremonial way, to move it carefully from the undress uniform he was changing out of to the dress blues that would go back on its rack for the next morning. Standard procedure. He held it for a moment in his gloved hand before removing the glove, the photograph visible through the white cotton, the face inside it familiar enough that he did not need to see it clearly. Clara Ruiz, 23 years old, forward observer, staff sergeant. Kandahar province 11 years ago. She had been thorough and patient and had carried the weight of her work with a calm that made everyone around her steadier. And she had died 40 meters from where Jack stood, and he had been unable to close that distance in time. And that was the fact. And the fact was not negotiable. And the only honest answer to the fact that Jack had found was this: the mat, the steps, the watch, the chain cordon held in place by a single procedural sentence delivered at the volume of a weather report. He put the photograph in the dress blues pocket. He smoothed the fabric flat with 2 fingers, pressing the pocket gently until the rectangular outline lay correctly against the chest. He hung the uniform on its rack, checked the crease in the trouser leg, and went to bed early, because the next morning's watch began at a time that required it. The next morning, another cold October morning with a sky the same pale gray as the one before it, he dressed in the same measured order that every old guard sentinel dresses, each piece of the uniform placed and checked and placed again, gloves smooth and white at the cuff, rifle clean and level, the breast pocket with its small weight pressed correctly against his chest. He walked to the tomb. The scaffolding was still there. The flagstone crew arrived at 9, a different supervisor today, a younger man who looked at the chain cordon and looked at the sentinel and said nothing, and routed his materials accordingly without needing to be told. He had been briefed. Perhaps. Or perhaps he simply read the site correctly the first time. Jack stepped onto the mat. 21 steps. A pause. 21 seconds. A turn. The October sky held its gray, and the tomb held its inscription, and the boots moved on the mat the way they move on the mat every 2 hours, every day, every season, through renovation and ceremony and rain and every kind of weather this country produces. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone was grateful or keeping score, or would offer any particular recognition at the end of the watch, because the debt is real, and the watch is real, and the steps are the only honest answer to both. 21 steps. The boots did not stop.